Institute. My name is Will Pomeranz. I'm Deputy Director here. Before we get started with our program, just a few words about some upcoming events. On April 24th, next week, from 10 to 11, we'll have several prominent members of the Russian media here to talk about how to run an independent media outlet in Russia. And then on April 26th, we'll be holding a joint program with the Wilson Center's Latin America program from 10 to 11:30 on the Venezuelan crisis, what is Russia's role? Well, I realize that it's still a bit cold outside, and we haven't really had spring yet, so it's hard to think about summer. But this summer will bring us the World Cup, and the world will be coming, instead of Sochi, to all of Russia, as it were, and Russia will be hosting the World Cup. Today we have two speakers to talk about the upcoming competition and the opportunities that it presents both politically and internationally for the Russian Federation. We have two outstanding speakers. Our first speaker will be Richard Arnold, Associate Professor of Political Science at Muskingum University, and also guest editor of a specific issue in Problems of Post-Communism on the World Cup in 2018. He is the author of Russian Nationalism and Ethnic Violence, which came out in 2016 with Routledge, as well as has written numerous articles in Post-Soviet Affairs, Political Science and Papers, and the Journal for the Study of Radicalism, and is a frequent commentator on the Jamestown Foundation's Eurasia Daily Monitor. We are also very pleased to be joined by Craig Esherick, who is Associate Professor at George Mason University, in addition to graduating from the DC Bar. I'm sure many of us know Mr. Esherick as the Georgetown basketball coach, where he served both as the assistant coach and also coached the varsity team as well. He was also assistant basketball coach for the USA Olympic team that won the bronze medal in the 1988 Seoul Olympics. He is still very active in sports management and sports activities, and as I mentioned, is an associate professor at George Mason University. So with that, I think we're going to turn things over to Richard.
Okay, so thank you for welcoming me here today. I'm going to give a little bit of background as to what I've done in Russia. I was fortunate enough to receive a grant from my university to travel to Russia and to go to a number of the World Cup host cities, and I've been working with my students to try and conduct research projects into the World Cup in Russia, as well as, of course, publishing this journal. So my first presentation is going to be on the international context that Russia finds itself in leading up to the World Cup. And, oh, it is working. And when we're talking about the World Cup, we are talking about an event that is going to last from the 14th of June to the 15th of July. It's going to take place in 11 cities all across European Russia. Of course, that is still an enormous chunk of territory and a lot of logistic problems associated with that. But in terms of this presentation, the question is, East-West relations are at a post-Cold War low. But yet Russia is due to host the largest sporting event on the planet. Earlier I was talking with Craig and we were discussing how if the Winter Olympics is the bronze medal of sporting events and the Summer Olympics is the silver medal of sporting events, then the World Cup is really the gold. All right, there's not that much between them, but that metaphor works quite well. So this is the largest sporting event on the planet, draws the most eyes on the planet. And it's an event which usually reflects and assists the integration of a country into the existing world order. So how can we explain that Russia is hosting the World Cup at this time? What threats to the World Cup are posed by the current world order? The most obvious answer is that, of course, the World Cup is awarded ahead of time. It was 2nd of December 2010 when the World Cup was awarded to Russia. Obviously, it was quite a controversial ceremony with the World Cup also going to Qatar a bit later, leading to lots of cries of allegations of bribery. I'm although I think there's a stronger case in the case of Qatar than there is of Russia. And of course, the world has changed a lot since 2010. So Russia has still been left with its obligation to host this event, even in the post-Crimean world. So while the World Cup is usually a chance for countries to integrate themselves and to promote tourism within their country, one gets a sense that the the biggest problem for the 2018 World Cup is just making sure nothing else goes wrong, making sure the situation doesn't deteriorate further. Oh, am I? No. What did I do? Okay. So looking at the context, the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the Russian interference in eastern Ukraine, and has led to the imposition of US-led sanctions. Similarly, the doping scandal at Sochi has been clouding Russia's name on the international sporting arena, although doping is less likely at the World Cup. The 2015 Russian intervention in Syria brought Russia back into the world order as a major player and someone who had to be negotiated with. And of course, we see the rounds of the claims of interference with the American elections and with elections throughout Europe, as well as the recent poisoning of Sergei Skripal in the UK. So even before the current deterioration in relations related to the Skripal poisoning, prominent Western politicians such as John McCain and the British MP Nick Farron had called for a boycott of the 2018 World Cup. They called for using it as a means of gaining leverage over Russia to force Russia into making certain concessions on the situation in Ukraine. Once again, the doping scandal at Sochi did threaten to overshadow the 2018 World Cup, particularly by giving Russia a reputation for cheating in international sports. And although doping is not unheard of in soccer, it's less likely to be a problem. But all such concerns have been rejected by the Russian regime as an information war that is being waged against Russia, a claim that the West is just out to punish. So we have a question of, so we have sanctions already against Russia in response to its annexation of Crimea and the pressure on the Donbass, as well as alleged interference in elections. There is a danger, of course, of increasing sanctions over the Sergei Skripal poisoning. Given the poisoning of Skripal and the diplomatic furore which has followed, the World Cup looks as though it could be a potential casualty in the diplomatic warfare between the powers. But consistent with previous actions, the mainstream Russian discourse has been to write this off as information warfare and come out with some claims that perhaps, in fact, it was MI5 or some of the British secret services that brought this up. In fact, the signs of the 2018 World Cup being held hostage to the recent Skripal poisoning transpired when Boris Johnson, the British Foreign Secretary, mentioned that as a possible retaliation for the alleged poisoning, the UK would not be permitting any home teams. Of course, England is the only home team going, but not be permitting any home teams to go and participate in the World Cup. Actual sanctions or actual boycotts that came from the poisoning, Theresa May has announced that no British ministers and none of the royal family will be going. A sort of symbolic attack there on the possible benefits of the World Cup. We also see a breakdown of bilateral relations as well as a possible new round of sanctions from the American president. But yet there are opportunities from the World Cup. Football, or as Americans know it, soccer, is the world's game, and the Russian hosting of the World Cup is a chance for Russia to increase its soft power, its status in the international arena. And this is consistent with a previous pattern of action on behalf of the Russian government, where the promotion of sport has really been one of the key goals they're seeking to promote. What with the 2013 Universiade in Kazan, of course the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics, the 2015 FINA Championships in Kazan, and ice hockey the ice hockey championships in Moscow and St. Petersburg this year. So there are opportunities for the World Cup to show off some of the vast and beautiful multi-ethnic country, in the words of Vladimir Putin, beyond Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as overcome popular stereotypes about Russia. Conceivably, it could act as the nucleus of a tourism program for the country, but in better times, and in better times, states have profited, the tourist industries have profited from the holding of World Cups. The paradigmatic example here being Germany in 2006, which experienced a great tourist boom after hosting the World Cup. But regrettably for football fans, however, there are only shallow chances that the 2018 World Cup will provide a boost to Russian clubs. Outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, there are genuine concerns about the longevity of the stadia. In particular, in Nizhny Novgorod and Kaliningrad, there are concerns that the stadia just won't be used because Russian football is not yet at the point where it's able to sustain such large crowds. So, so I wanted to end this initial presentation setting the international context by saying I think the main takeaway from this is that the main concern for Russia is avoiding anything going wrong at the World Cup, which could lead to even further isolation, as opposed to reaping any of the conventional rewards from sporting events, about which my colleague Craig will talk in a minute. And I wanted to end by offering a slide showing the estimates of Russian students as to how well the Russian team will do, as to who will have the victory in the World Cup. This data comes from a survey of 5,000 Russian students carried out by a Russian sociologist at Urals Federal University in Yekaterinburg. And as you can see, the Russian team is not expected to do very well. There's only very few people are estimating that the Russian team will get through to the final. Some of them are many of them are even waging that Russia will not be able to get out of the group stages. And indeed, FIFA recently just downgraded the Russian team. Most of them are expecting Germany or Brazil to win. Interestingly, some of them responded that the US or Italy, teams who have not even qualified for the World Cup, are going to do the best in the games. But with that, I'll turn over to Craig.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mega events and also about sport diplomacy and sport for development, kind of to set the stage for some of the things that events like the World Cup can accomplish on behalf of governments, on behalf of non-governmental organizations, and also on behalf of public organizations like the NBA, like publicly traded companies like Nike, Adidas, and Under Armour, and a little bit of the community building things that these mega events can accomplish. Just a personal anecdote, and my contact information is right there if anybody needs to get in touch with me, but I was a basketball coach for 25 years before I became a professor, and the single biggest and most enjoyable part of my career as a coach and also as a basketball player was my involvement in the Summer Olympics in 1988 in Seoul. And it was a variety of things, but we represented the United States as the basketball coaches for our country, but we were able to compete at an international level against countries from all over the world, and during the course of that, you had to go around and scout and watch people play. You got a chance to meet players from all over the world, and you got a chance to meet coaches from all over the world, and it really brought home the impact that an event like this can have on bringing people together. And I know that there are an awful lot of people that think that the Olympics and the World Cup does exactly the opposite. But I am not one of those people. I think this is a great opportunity for governments, for people that do business, and also for coaches and athletes to get to know people from other parts of the world, and I can attest that it was a great experience for me. So the silver medal here in terms of mega events are the Summer Olympics. Summer Olympics are a group of competitions, not just one sport like, I hate to use the American word soccer, but not just soccer, but track and field and basketball and water polo and swimming and all those things that are involved in the Summer Olympic program. The Summer Olympics is one of the most watched events in the world, and the next Summer Olympics is going to be in Tokyo in 2020. The last Summer Olympics were in Rio in 2016, and I share the concern of Rich in terms of when we host these events, you have a situation like Brazil that hosted the World Cup in 2014, hosted the Summer Olympics in 2016, and we're spending all this money to build all this sports infrastructure, and will those facilities be used at all after the Olympics leave in 2016? Will they be used in Tokyo in 2020, 2018? How much of those facilities in Pyeongchang are going to be used? There was one of my colleagues that did a study in Athens after the Olympics was held there in 2004, and he went around and visited 21 of the Olympic sites, and of those 21 sites, one of the 21 was being used for anything in Athens. And so you wonder why Greece has economic problems. That could be one of the reasons why. So the bronze medal is the Winter Olympics. We just had the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, and certainly Pyeongchang and the Winter Olympics are not why North Korea and South Korea are doing an awful lot of talking now, where before the Winter Olympics they were not. But I have to say that but for the Winter Olympics, I wonder if we would not have had this opportunity for these two countries to spend as much time talking, and for our country to be involved in discussions with North Korea. So this was a great opportunity for countries to talk, and certainly a great opportunity for North Koreans to visit South Korea and participate in the Olympics. We sent, we meaning George Mason, sent a group of students over there for a study abroad program, and every single student absolutely loved it, and it was a great experience for them. They actually worked for 2 weeks for the third event that I'm going to talk about, the Paralympics. Every host of every Summer and Winter Olympics has to agree to host an Olympics for athletes with physical disabilities right after the main event. And the Paralympics were very successful, and our students from George Mason were able to work it's actually not called ice hockey, it's called sled hockey or para hockey, and they came back being very impressed with these athletes and some of the things that they're able to do. And again, Paralympics is an opportunity for people from all over the world to get together, athletes from all over the world and coaches to get together and talk about common problems, talk about their sport, but also talk about what life is like back in the countries where each one of these athletes and coaches are from. Another major event for former British colonies is the Commonwealth Games. The Commonwealth Games, like the Winter and the Summer Olympics, occur every 4 years. We don't, and we are a former British colony. The United States does not participate in the Commonwealth Games. And as a former basketball coach, I can tell you I'm offended that basketball is not on the program at the Commonwealth Games. Hopefully one day they will see the light. But the Commonwealth Games was last held in Toronto in 2015. And again, it's a great opportunity from a professional standpoint. This guy's shaking his head no. From a professional standpoint, it's a great opportunity for these countries to get together and meet and diplomatic exchanges, but also it's an opportunity for people to get ready for the next summer or the next winter or the next competition, and so they can train and compete against some of the world's best. The next mega event is the Pan Am Games. Pan Am Games are multi-sport competitions between North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. It's usually 1 year before the Olympics, or 2 years before the Olympics, and the Pan Am Games, again, are another opportunity for athletes, coaches to get together and to talk and hopefully establish better relations and build community, and also to entertain people that are interested in some great sport as well. Okay, one of the things that we've been involved in at George Mason and also we've studied is how sport can be used for development. Sport can be an opportunity to develop fans and customers for companies like Nike, Under Armour, and Adidas. It also can be an opportunity to use a sport like soccer or a sport like basketball to bring people together to build community, but sports can also be used for AIDS, HIV education. Sports can be used to encourage young people to get involved more aggressively in education. So sport can be used as the hook to bring kids into the fold and to get them involved in things that help to build social capital and also help to build community in places all over the world. Okay, sport is also used for diplomatic purposes. We've done a grant with the U.S. Department of State for the last 7 years, myself and 2 other colleagues at George Mason, and we are part of the first bullet point up there, the Sports Visitors Program. We brought athletes, coaches, and sports administrators from all over the world to the United States to familiarize themselves with how we do things athletically, to introduce them to the culture of the United States, and also let them see and meet with people that are soccer players like they are, coaches like they are, sports administrators like they are. And there's also 2 other programs that our government sponsors. One is a Sports Envoy program where we send athletes and coaches around the world to give clinics and to meet people in their sports. And we also do a sports grants program where non-governmental organizations can put together their own programs, and those programs are vetted and approved by our State Department, and they do a combination of either Sport Envoy or Sports Visitors programs with selected countries that the State Department uses around the world. We are not the only country around the world that does this type of thing, that uses sport for diplomatic purposes. And I'll put a plug in now. I just edited a book on case studies in sport diplomacy, and one of my authors is sitting in the 3rd row back here, and he wrote a book on Putin in the Olympics in 2014, and certainly Russia has used sport for diplomatic purposes, South Korea, North Korea, Japan, you name it, Brazil, Iran, and so we certainly did not invent the wheel there, and there are an awful lot of countries that believe that sport is a great vehicle not only to bring people together and build community, but it's also a great vehicle to get your message out to other countries around the world. We've used prominent athletes to do this, okay? And in a most recent initiative by our last president, President Obama, he enlisted the services of Shaquille O'Neal, famous center from the Lakers and Miami Heat, and he took a trip down to Havana to teach some basketball and also to meet some Cubans, and also help President Obama try and open up communication channels between our country and Cuba. This was also sponsored by the U.S. Department of State and the NBA. The NBA also sponsors initiatives where they send prominent athletes to other countries. These are some pictures of an initiative they did in Sudan, in South Sudan, where they sent a player that I actually coached at Georgetown, Dikembe Mutombo, for a visit to, is it Juba or Juba? Juba, which is the capital of South Sudan. And again, an opportunity to use sport to bring people together, and hopefully that's what our leaders in Russia are going to be attempting to do with the World Cup, to bring people together, have some sports give but also bring people together and give people an opportunity to talk to each other.
I think it was Nelson Mandela who said sports is probably the most effective means of diplomacy in the world. Of course, George Orwell also said that competitive sports were war minus the shooting. So take one of those interpretations as you will. So my second presentation is going to be on security challenges to the 2018 World Cup. Sufyan, we already designated Sufyan. There was a lot of concern about the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics that were being held in a region that had been racked by terrorist violence. And there were expectations, maybe, that terrorists would try and attack the games. Now, of course, thankfully that didn't happen, and the Russians did an excellent job of providing security in the Sochi 2014 Winter Olympics. However, as my previous slide showed, the previous presentation showed, the 2018 World Cup is a much different endeavour. You've got a lot more cities involved. You've got 11 rather than one of which, by the way, is Sochi. You've got 11 cities rather than one. You've got transportation between those cities. You've got training camps. I forget just exactly how many cities are hosting training camps for the World Cup, but it's a much greater. Oh, I did it again. It's a much greater endeavour. So, following on from my previous presentation, when I said, I think one of the big challenges here is for perhaps the big job is to avoid potential embarrassment. There are a number of security challenges to Russia hosting the 2018 World Cup, including radical Islam, the conflict in the Donbass, the threat from hooligans, of all things, the threat of societal racism, anti-homosexual attitudes, infrastructure challenges, and of course the security services themselves. So, moving on to radical Islam, the radical Islamists, in their incarnation in the North Caucasus at the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics for the Caucasus Emirate, from what I understand now, ISIS has really become the main organization that is helping to coordinate terrorist challenges in the North Caucasus now. You have a really significant threat for the potential of a terrorist attack. The Russian response at Sochi to the threat of terrorism was to impose a ring of steel on the city and to fight the terrorists in their territorial base in Dagestan. That approach is probably not going to work, or not going to have the same effect, for exactly the reasons I mentioned. You have people traveling between cities. You have a vast number of cities involved. You have training camps in all different places, and of course, people going off into different areas to see parts of the country. And ISIS has demonstrated, or has expressed a willingness or a desire to attack the 2018 World Cup. The picture you see behind me is of a leaflet, I think, that was found at the city of Volgograd, which is going to be a World Cup host, saying, "Wait for us." The terrorists are saying, "Wait for us. We're going." If you look at some of the iconography on there, the threat is very apparent. We're going to attack the 2018 World Cup. Now, I should mention, no one of these challenges, I believe, is insurmountable on its own. I think it's been demonstrated that the Russians can pull off very good sporting events. But combined, the combination of all these challenges makes it a much more significant problem. So another challenge that is faced by the Russian state in providing a secure World Cup is, of course, the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the region known as Donbass. We have the separatist regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, where you have rebel commanders. It's extremely unclear how much control they have over their forces. And with all those tourists, those rich American tourists, I think Americans are expected to be the second largest group of tourists attending the World Cup, despite the fact that the United States did not qualify. So we have all those tourists who are a potential source of revenue for kidnapping and extorting ransoms. Of course, it's also unknown what the goals of the elites themselves in these regions are. Yes, they may be subservient to Moscow. Yes, they may do what Moscow wants, but there's still a non-trivial chance that something could go wrong, particularly when the host city of Rostov is, I think that's less than 30 miles from the border with Ukraine. Rostov's really a very beautiful city, but it is extremely close to the war zone. As if those two, additionally, the ongoing conflict in the North Caucasus, which has been raging for the last 28 years or 26 years, and the conflict in Donbass have led to a proliferation of firearms in Russia. Russia, being a European state, has a European approach to maintaining strict gun control. many firearms have spilled out from the conflict in Donbass and from the conflict in the North Caucasus. And as if these weren't significant enough challenges, there is also the challenge from hooligans. As we saw at the 2016 UEFA Championships, when Russian hooligans beat England fans quite mercilessly, and the hooligans pose a significant threat to the safety and security of England fans. Part of the reason is that the English have been venerated throughout Europe as having the crown of being the kings of the hooligan league, if you like. And so this was an attempt for the Russian hooligans to show that they have their own mettle and they have their own worth and they can take the hooligan crown from the English.
Don't they want to play soccer?
Maybe not, given the team. There's also, the BBC documentary on Russia's hooligan army also alleged that there were potential links with Kremlin forces, suggesting that perhaps this was another form of hybrid warfare. I'm not persuaded of that, but I think it's a possibility. But this poses a very different threat to the Islamists. The Islamists presumably are going to be involved in high-profile terrorist attacks which are going to require explosives or other arms. This is a much more disparate violence that shows a risk of appearing anywhere there are problems. Now, in fairness, the Russian authorities have come down quite hard on the hooligans, saying to prominent hooligans, so my sources tell me that you should probably not be here for the World Cup or we'll make your life very difficult. So they're sort of saying just get out of town for the time for a month or so. But we'll see how effective that is. Another problem comes from societal racism. Russia quite famously did not have an overseas empire. So the level of, and while Russia is polyethnic, the picture of ethnic diversity that it has, and I wrote about this in my 2015 article, the picture of ethnic diversity that they have in Russia is much more of a mosaic than a melting pot, where regions have their own traditions and are established on their own traditions. In fact, in the Soviet period, individual mixing at the level of individual ethnic diversity was restricted by the use of the Propiska system, or Propiska system, which survives to this day. So you have sometimes some quite overtly racist attitudes are held by ordinary people. And a number of intellectual legacies suggest that certain characteristics are innate, and that the Soviet theory of ethnos, which came out in the 80s, suggested that ethnicity was a natural phenomenon and seeps into the popular culture. So we have societal racism, where there's just a general insensitivity to racial differences, as expressed by the gentleman there in the 2017 Confederations Cup in the city of Sochi. The Confederations Cup is a practice, a dry run for the World Cup. He wore blackface to welcome the Ghanaian team, something that in the West would be seen as extremely offensive, almost mocking. Similarly, in 2006, Russia had the highest level of hate crimes in the developed world. The Moscow's Savas Center keeps track of these hate crimes, and I think by 2006 we were seeing levels around 900 or even more hate crimes a year. It's fair to say that the level of hate crimes has come down, especially since the 2014 annexation of Crimea. But it's also fair to say that the root causes of this have not been tackled. It's more suppression than it is, or repression than it is anything else. Likewise, Russians have an approach to traditional attitudes on sexual relations. Homophobia has been and was a concern ahead of the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics. the law that was prohibiting the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships still on the books and is still in force today. The picture behind you that you see is actually taken from Novaya Gazeta, which was detailing attacks, the construction of concentration camps for homosexuals in Kadyrov's Chechnya. It's unclear whether there's going to be any problems coming from this, but it's a possibility. So, moving on to infrastructure. Of course, one of the big problems of having the World Cup in 11 cities is that you have to move people between those cities in an efficient manner. Now, the Russian train network is really great. It's fantastic being able to get on in one city and go pretty much anywhere as long as you have enough time. The problem is it's really slow, and so many of the promised high-speed rail lines have not been developed. There is a high-speed rail line between St. Petersburg and Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod, but I don't think there are any more high-speed rail lines. In fact, I was looking at the website the other day, and it said that plane tickets, flights, have been purchased mostly between Moscow and Yekaterinburg and Moscow and Volgograd, which are 28 and 32-hour train rides away from the capital, respectively. One city that is holding the World Cup, Saransk, is really very isolated indeed, and it's difficult to get there by rail. Maybe we've got a possibility of flights. Well, many of the airports are not upgraded. There's been a large number of airports which have been upgraded. However, I believe they're still waiting on the upgrades to the domestic terminal at Volgograd. I'd be surprised. Thank you. I'd be surprised if the Saransk airport has been upgraded. And then there's the problem of the security services themselves. In this case, maybe the cure is worse than the disease. The FSB and police have exercised strict control over visitors, especially so in Volgograd, where a number of human rights researchers have been detained and have been questioned by the police, and it gives little confidence that the regular bribery might not allow those with ill intentions to slip through. Now, in fairness, for going back to our survey, it is fair to say that the Russians are aware of this as well. If you look at the slide, and I'm going to have to hold this a bit closer, but one of the biggest fears that is expressed by Russian students about the upcoming World Cup is the fear of terrorism and the fear of hooligan violence. So they're certainly worried about these things spilling out. So to conclude, just on a positive note, I think Russia's going to be a fantastic host for the World Cup, and despite all these security risks, I wish I was going. It has many incredibly beautiful things to see, including the mosque in Kazan, the pictures you see behind me, the mosque in Kazan, the Rodina Mat statue in Volgograd, which is the former city of Stalingrad, celebrating the victory in the Second World War, and the riverside towns of Rostov and Samara. The picture on the right you see is of Nizhny Novgorod, which has a Kremlin. I think it's older than the Kremlin in Moscow. It's very worth a visit. There's also an extraordinary number of steps leading down from the river up to the up to the centre city. But in short, there are an extraordinary number of challenges to a secure and successful World Cup. And to repeat, no one of these is insurmountable on its own. But cumulatively, who knows?
Okay, thank you so much. I want to begin with these practical questions because I think there's still more that needs to be developed. First of all, I'm very interested to know how much this costs the Russian Federation. Clearly, they had to rebuild or revamp 10 out of 11 stadiums. I don't know if any stadium actually met the requirements. They had to build hotels. They have to create, a means to accommodate all these people that are coming. How much did this cost? Where will people stay? Is Russia really ready to kind of welcome, hundreds of thousands of people to Russia? And has Russia done any advanced screening of these people who are coming? My understanding is that they don't even need a visa to come. They just have to show a ticket, and they pretty much gets to come in. And I can assure you that anyone who has traveled to Russia before the World Cup will know that simply showing up with a ticket to a sporting match is not enough to get you into the Russian Federation. So to what extent? You mean you've talked about the security risks and you highlighted them, but they're really going to be tested in multiple areas, and the risk of multiple failures, based on even on your presentation, appear to be high. So so if you can just quantify those numbers and kind of give your assessment as to you know, the likelihood of something going out of control.
Thank you. Excellent questions. Yeah. Regarding the costs, prior to Sochi, we had Nemtsov and various other whistleblowers producing reports suggesting that the costs of the Sochi Olympics were enormously higher. I haven't been able to find any reliable estimates of the cost of the World Cup. I think that one of the most authoritative I've seen suggests 18 billion in terms of upgrading infrastructure and building hotels and new stadia. Compared to Sochi, however, of course, that's a bargain. Sochi was estimated to cost 55 billion. But actually, in this special edition, Daniel Wolf and Martin Muller provide an explanation for this, because the money's dried, to a large extent, the money's dried up, right? The money is not as prevalent as it was before Sochi. They've initiated a stage of what they call crisis neo-patrimonialism, where the Russian state has to be much more efficient in how it determines which elites to reward with which contracts. But the short answer is the most authoritative estimate is 18 billion. I haven't seen any further investigations into that. There's just as you mentioned, there's just an enormous number of upgrades, and it's also a methodological question of what counts as a cost of the World Cup and what counts as something that just would have been done anyway, like upgrading or building the new high-speed rail line to Nizhny Novgorod. Should that be included as a cost of the World Cup? In terms of screening, as I understand it, having a ticket, it's slightly more complex. I think you apply for a fan passport, and before you turn up, and you have to have the fan passport, but you only need the ticket to get the fan passport. So whereas traveling to Russia normally requires something in the region of a $250 visa, you know, unless you're fortunate enough to live in.
And you have to answer a lot of questions.
And a lot of questions, right? It's just a fan passport this time. And I understand that, for example, the English authorities, who have knowledge of who the prominent hooligans are in Great Britain, are working with the Russians. But again, this kind of collaboration could be undermined by the international context. So it creates quite a combustible mix, I think is how I'd phrase it.
Fair enough. Open for questions. Right here.
Can we get you to repeat it with the mic? Sorry. So in your travels to the World Cup host cities, which ones have you found need the most improvement before June? And relatedly, for the smaller cities that I assume need a lot of new infrastructure built, do you believe that this infrastructure development will help them in the future generate economic growth?
Okay, thank you. Interesting question. So I visited, in October 2016, I visited Moscow, Kazan, Yekaterinburg, Saransk, Nizhny Novgorod, and then Moscow again. And in 2017, I visited, and that was in May 2017, I went back to Moscow, Kazan, Yekaterinburg, and I also went to Volgograd and Rostov. So I haven't been to all of the cities. I haven't been to Yekaterinburg, and I've been to St. Petersburg before, but I presume St. Petersburg is going to have a very well-developed public transport system in any case. It's hard to say. I think I have concern. I mean, Saransk, I think, was the seemed like. Oh, and I also went to Samara on that October trip. Excuse me. Saransk, I think, was a city that needed more infrastructure and more development. But I think so. I think I would say Saransk and maybe Samara, perhaps as needing development. But again, it's a hard question to answer because I was there in 2016, and a lot of time's gone by since 2016. So, and that's only based on my impressions, my impressionistic account. In terms of economic development, yeah, I think it could be, if the money's spent wisely, I think it could be a great chance for economic development, and certainly local infrastructure has improved in a couple of cities really quite significantly. However, there's also problems about corruption over the stadia and people bidding for no-bid contracts and trying to take money from the federal centre. In particular, there was a case in Samara where the local oligarchs, the local businessmen, were basically trying to compete for the lucrative federal contract to build the stadium. So if the money's not wasted, yeah, sure, I think it could be a good source of income. I think when the Russians got the World Cup in 2010, one of the big hopes was that the World Cup will showcase our country, and it's really beautiful. And look at all these things that we have, and those are still there. But of course, international relations are so strained right now. It's hard to say whether the benefits will materialize from increased tourism. Craig, did you want to?
Typically, a lot of the Commonwealth Games, I was in New Delhi in 2010, and they were literally constructing and redoing the city 2 months before the games actually started. I don't know if the Russians are going to procrastinate to that extent, but a lot of these mega events, a lot of the major parts of the infrastructure won't be completed till very close to when these events actually take place.
And that's the case with the Volgograd.
And I know, in relation to what Rich said about infrastructure, I know the two major sources of infrastructure problems for Greece were the airport, the brand new airport that they built before 2004, and the very nice train from the airport to Athens, which was extremely expensive. So that definitely helped the city, but it was an extreme amount of expense for a country like Greece at that time.
So I want to get back to this again. The atmosphere of these games. Has there been any discussion about protests by Russians, that Russian opposition will see this as an opportunity to organize and try to do something during the games, or alternatively, is there any talk of the foreign teams kind of reacting to events going around the world? If by chance, another event occurs in Syria during the middle of the games, is there any possibility that the teams that are participating will either protest through black bands? Will they not want their national anthems played? There's a whole variety of ways by which you can protest and undermine these games and undermine the World Cup. I'm just curious to what extent there's a risk of that.
Excellent questions. Yeah, I would be surprised if Navalny does not try and do something at the games. I think he would. It seems like a situation where he might try and use the stage that it provides to create a national protest, particularly considering he was barred from running in the recent presidential election on somewhat spurious grounds. But is there a question that the teams themselves could protest? Yeah, I think that's a real possibility. And again, it just makes this event all the more interesting. I can't remember a World Cup being so controversial as Russia 2018. Of course, being an Englishman, I think Italia 90 was extremely controversial because we lost in the semis and we shouldn't. But but I can't remember a World Cup being as a greater source of advanced controversy. And maybe Craig can help jog my memory here, but I can't remember a World Cup being a source of such a controversy before the games even begin. And certainly, part of the threat, part of the worry, I think, is that teams will try and bring politics into the World Cup, and they will try and, maybe the ultimate sanction is, of course, we're going to go home. We're going to stop playing. We're not going to play games with you. So, but certainly wearing black armbands or, and I think that risk is increased if let's say non-white players or fans experience discrimination, be it in whatever form. That's a significant risk, a very significant risk, and it's not one that can really be stopped very easily. So,
Craig, what do you think what is your attitude toward protests? You talked about the importance of games bringing you together. Obviously, you must have experienced some elements of protest or people who wanted to use it as a different statement.
How do you respond? I attended the '84 Olympics in L.A., and the ultimate form of protest is a boycott. Right. And the Russians and a lot of their satellite neighbors did not attend, and we did not attend the Moscow Olympics in 1980. And I think the one wild card here that I think Putin can't control is that we're going to have networks from all over the world. And those networks are going to send that picture back to their host countries, and Putin is not going to be able to control what they send back. So there may be an opportunity for some of these countries to do some things, and some of these athletes to do some things that they may not normally be able to do on a typical visit to Russia. Right. So it's going to be interesting to see what does happen.
Right here. Right here.
Yeah, first of all, I can't believe America didn't get into the Olympics, and that was because of an own goal against Trinidad, of all places. I seem to also recall that one of the great players was Pulisic, whose parents were coaching somewhere out in Virginia. But my question is, could you compare Brazil's Olympics against Russia in terms of scope, number of cities involved? I remember they had some polluted swimming pools and stuff like that, but they seemed to pull it off.
You mean the World Cup?
Yeah, World Cup. But
okay. Yeah. I meant to look this up. I forget exactly how many cities were involved in Brazil, but again, and I think this is part of an effort by FIFA to reach out into non-traditional host countries. So we had in 2002 we had Seoul and South Korea, excuse me. In 2010 we had South Africa. Brazil, of course, being part of South America, is a traditional host country, but we're seeing this attempt to bring more countries into the international football world. So, but the short answer to your question is, I didn't look up that information, so I'm reluctant to commit myself. But maybe Craig can help.
The only thing I would say, just in relation to what you're saying, is that I know that many of the stadiums that they used in 2014 are not being used at all, or underutilized. They may have a couple thousand fans attending a stadium that's 50,000 people, seats 50,000 people, particularly that one they built in the Amazon. I'm sure that that's being completely underutilized.
And that's in Brazil, which has a very established soccer culture. Russia has a soccer culture, but because the climate is much more like North America, even more so, the soccer season is short, and it's a summer soccer season, so it runs, I think, from March to October or November.
What is FIFA saying? Because FIFA itself is not the most transparent of organizations. Is FIFA ready for the backlash that might happen if indeed something goes radically wrong in Russia? I mean, what sort of statements have they been making leading up to the World Cup?
It's been a lot of very positive statements, things like the World Cup infrastructure is 90% ready. That was last month. And saying that this is going to be a fantastic World Cup. In response, are they ready if something goes wrong? No. Quite frankly, I don't see it. But again, that's a judgment call.
Right here.
Thank you for your presentations. Very interesting. So I guess this is a question for the three of you. The day before the World Cup starts, the FIFA Congress, so all 211 football associations will be voting on the 2026 World Cup. And the United States, Canada, and Mexico are bidding the United bid against Morocco. And many people would say that obviously Russia, not only the FA, but also the government will be lobbying very hard for Morocco. Obviously, there's a geopolitical context. They're also very angry about what Sochi and the Olympic ban, and also many people in the football community and probably in Russia are very angry at the Americans for the Justice Department investigation into FIFA. Some would say, rightly or wrongly, that the United States would not have done that had they won the 2022 World Cup bid against Qatar. So my question is, how much will the Russian government, again, there's votes happening in Moscow before the day before the World Cup starts, how much are they going to lobby, do you think, all 211 countries geopolitically, but also the Football Association, to make sure that the United bid does not win? Thank you very much.
I would totally agree with your concept that Russia definitely does not want us to win the bid, and even more so now in the last couple of weeks. And so what will they do? Well, if everyone that's voting is you're saying everyone's voting is going to be in Moscow? Yeah, they probably have, there's a lot that they probably can do to lobby each one of the people that are going to vote. It's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah,
very interesting.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of this is an opportunity to, there's a certain kind of status to holding the World Cup, a status boost, and I think Russia's be very reluctant to see the United States receive that status boost. But who knows? It could be an olive branch that is extended.
You've talked about the physical security threats as far as the counterterrorism threat is concerned. Do you have any guidance for Americans traveling to Russia where the counterintelligence threats might be concerned, where FSB, physical surveillance, electronic surveillance?
I think just stay out of trouble. Don't put yourself in any compromising situations. Nothing that could be used against you. Watch yourself in public, and I think there's also a certain safety valve, because I don't think the Russians are going to want to draw negative attention unnecessarily. So, could it be the case that some situations are fabricated and trumped up to arrest foreign nationals? Sure, but I think there's going to be a certain kind of reluctance to do that to great an extent, because of course they don't want to draw negative attention. However, I will say that if international relations get even worse between the United States and Russia, I certainly see that as being a possibility. One of my friends in Moscow, who's actually leader of the program, the organization CSKA Fans Against Racism, has said this is like a last chance for Russia and America to pull back from the brink, and this is a really great opportunity for them to try and re-establish international contacts and sort of positive feelings towards each other. It's an open question as to what extent that's going to be undermined.
Well, we're going to bring this to a close. I guess I'm still not convinced that the United States is going to be the second largest contingent. I'm not willing to bet on the outcome of the World Cup, but I am willing to bet that the United States is most likely not the second largest number of fans going to the games. I guess my last question, and just a brief one, is what does Putin envision his role at this upcoming World Cup? Is he going to be at all the matches? Is he just going to be at the beginning and the end? What do you see his role, and how will he feel when Russia doesn't get out of the qualifying rounds?
Well, they might surprise you, but the foreign team might get mysteriously ill the night before.
Or the referees.
Yeah, that happened in the soccer war, right? In Honduras and El Salvador, they sort of made a lot of noise the night before outside the other team's hotel, so they didn't get any sleep. What's Putin's role in this? Obviously he's going to be at the final. I don't know, of course, what matches he's going to attend. I think a lot of that depends on how well the Russian team does. But I think this is all part of. I think this is part of his legacy, his building of his status, and the contributions he's made to Russia and the development of sport. And I will end by saying that since the 1990s, when there was a lot of social degradation in Russia, there was a particular image of Russians as being drunk, and living fairly unhealthy lives, borne out by, I think, the fact that male life expectancy was 56 at one point. The Russian government's been working hard to overcome that, and sport has been a part of that. There's been a lot of emphasis on promoting sport as a way of promoting a healthy lifestyle, way of promoting less smoking, less drinking, and increased physical fitness. So I think overall this is part of Putin's legacy to the world, and to Russia. And I think he's got quite a lot of personal capital invested in this, because it was just as with Sochi. He wanted to make himself look like the person who brought Sochi to Russia, and he was the, if you like, the savior. It's the same thing with the World Cup. I'll just end by saying that I don't have any business cards, so my contact information is on the screen behind me.
Great. Well, thank you very much for both of your presentations. Thank you for your questions, and look forward to seeing you.